such a compliment from you, Pietro. The best Italian curator and art critique of our time, as editor of Quadrante, you've inspired many of us architects.
Yes, moving to Brazil was actually a great achievement. I was able to build the most important collection of European art in Latin America when I created the Art Museum of São Paulo. If our courageous magazine Quadrante were still running when you inaugurated this building, the Casa del Mutilato, on 1939, we would definitely have had an edition dedicated exactly to this building.
Can you also speak Italian, Lina?
Yes, of course. I was born in Rome, and I lived in Italy for 32 years of my life. I did all my architectural studies here.
Oh, sorry. I thought you were Brazilian.
No.
Mussolini came to lay the foundation stone. How proud I was to be part of this revolution, the new nation project.
It's true. Mussolini involved architects in the formation of the nation.
There was a lot of work for us architects and urban designers. New towns, roads, and public buildings such as sport facilities, post offices, schools, train station. The revolution awarded us with an active, constructive period, also and especially after the declaration of the empire, which opened a whole new territory of experimentation where we could test our ideas of modern living and civilization.
What did you say?
Nothing, I'm singing. Don't you know that song? It says, believe, I will not. Start over, I will never. Life went on, and you just did not see that you stayed behind. It is a pity that you were never shown much interest in Brazilian culture. Your idea was to come here and bring your own culture. Your idea of civilization is a colonization.
Of course, this also helped your career. It is essential to have connection to be able to achieve our goals.
What are our goals?
Well, to perform my profession, to build.
To build? Is this your priority? But you said you also believe that you're responsible for contributing to the evolution of the society. So not just buildings, right?
I am an architect. I am contributing to the society with my profession. I do what I can, and that is to design.
But would you shift ideology to satisfy your building desires? I've dreamed of civilization based on happiness and freedom that enriches and respects the local creativity aspect and form of living. I mean, to enhance it not as a folklore, not as a documentation of an exotic and fun, curious style, but as a true cultural strength.
Yes, Elena, always your beautiful words, but you were also part of the museum. You, in fact, were the architect. And do you remember how you managed to obtain the plot to build? Do you remember that you offered full support for the mayor of São Paulo presidential political campaign in all newspapers, radio and television stations of the country in exchange for land? The offer was in fact only possible because our partner and close friend, Assis Chateaubriand, owned all the media networks at that time. This is how everything always happens.
Yeah, at least the architect of the museum is a woman. The people were proud of that, and it compensates for the lack of female representation in its art collection. Only 6% of female artists.
It is impossible to disconnect architecture from politics. Lina, you cannot judge those of us who stayed in Italy to serve our country in our field. You left for whatever was doing my work. And if it weren't me, it would have been someone else. Don't blame anyone if you were not present. I am proud of that design, but I don't agree with the fascist war. I don't agree with any war.
So I don't understand. To me, that's a big contradiction.
What are you saying? Every action of Mussolini was in fact an action of peace. Italy has given peace to the world.
Do you still believe that this building promotes peace? That Mussolini has given peace to the world?
I don't know. This is for what I designed it for, not for war. I'm getting confused. What should we do with this building?
What do you mean? What should we do? This building talks and is part of Italian history. It should remain, of course, as it is.
But it only talks about one side of history.
What should we do? Demolish it?
No. This is the best architecture produced in Italy since the Renaissance. Rationalist, or if you prefer, call it fascist architecture, is enclosed in our built environment. It should certainly be preserved as an original.
Of course, we have great respect. But to desecrate an area by involving it in paper and plaster means to ignore humanity's grueling and painful progress. Every centimeter it advances is set several kilometers back by incompetence, dilettantism, and ignorance.
I don't know what to think anymore. Lina is right. That an architect's duty is to serve the collective, so we must reorient the building towards a meaningful purpose for the current society.
But there are beautiful souls and less beautiful souls. In general, the former perform little and the others perform more.
Nina, go and make coffee. Originally, I thought that would be more important that Professor Nicola Bacca will give this lecture in Italian, because of course we'll have a different taste, and also will speak more directly to an Italian public.
Costruzioni in colonie significa costruire una colonia laggiù, in Africa, nel caso italiano, ma anche nella testa degli italiani in Italia. Allora, costruzioni di colonie è un gioco di parole per dire che quando parliamo di manufatti coloniali, noi parliamo di una costruzione fuori dall'Italia, ma anche per gli italiani. Io non credo che questo edificio sia coloniale. Io credo che questo è un edificio fascista pensato nel momento del fascismo. Questo per essere più precisi. Credo anche che gli africani sono stati in Italia durante il periodo del fascismo e anzi prima, durante il periodo liberale. L'Italia è stata una potenza coloniale sin dalla sua unificazione, non c'è bisogno di aspettare il fascismo. Ma non vorrei che gli africani tornassero qui e vedessero questo edificio e stessero come stavano allora. perché il colonialismo è finito. Non c'è più. Qualunque critica post-coloniale non può negare che il colonialismo storicamente è finito. Siamo in una fase post-coloniale, non siamo più in una fase coloniale.
The history of, if I understand, the history of colonialism is finished.
Absolutely.
And so you were saying that one does not see here what one would have seen were one in the time. And he mentions colonial Africa. But that's so far a kind of something.
Okay.
The question is come si cambia quando si passa? So how does it change when you go from a nation to an empire and then from an empire to a nation?
Tutta l'Europa affronta una fase di nostalgia coloniale e in tutta Europa intellettuali e studiosi di diverse discipline se ne occupano. Come qualunque nostalgia popolare, la colonialgia, potremmo dire, colonialgia, diventa un fenomeno di consumo, ma è qualcosa che rischia di toccare anche la politica e gli intellettuali. Lo si era già visto per la Ostalgia, che dal 1993 era entrata anche nei dizionari tedeschi, cioè la nostalgia del passato comunista. Ma nel caso della colonialgia c'è qualcosa di più, perché il colonialismo moderno europeo è durato mezzo millennio, mentre il comunismo sovietico solo 100 anni. E c'è qualcosa di più anche perché la colonialgia si è sviluppata, mentre in Europa stavano ora ad affollarsi tanti africani, tanti asiatici, quanto mai ve ne erano stati nel passato. Allora in questo contesto la colonialgia rischia di funzionare da elemento divisivo delle nuove comunità nazionali post-coloniali, in particolare dal sentimento identitario delle maggioritarie componenti bianche, ma non di tutte le società post-coloniali. Gli urbanisti sono preoccupati dagli architetti che vogliono salvare tutto.
And the urbanists are worried about the architects who want to save everything.
I geografi pongono il problema dell'organizzazione spaziale.
The geographers are posing the problem of the spatial organization.
Gli storici urbani, gli urban historians, storici delle città coloniali, purtroppo sono pochi e non ci aiutano molto.
And the colonial historians who are studying this are unfortunately too few and therefore not as helpful as they could be.
Dal mio punto di vista di storico, mi pare grave che per tutti questi palazzi coloniali, per molti di questi palazzi coloniali, dalla storia dell'architettura e dell'urbanistica coloniale italiana, o anche dalla storia dei monumenti coloniali, manca quasi del tutto la visione dal basso, cioè la visione dei petit blancs o dei poor white, e manca soprattutto la visione delle popolazioni native, che poi erano in diversa misura i veri destinatari di questi palazzi, di queste opere coloniali.
Well, and so it really the big question as he sees this right now is that there is missing a whole, history of the bottom up, in which much more would need to be understood about the very people whose lives were affected by these policies. And these people were the people that were either brought over here from the colonies or who fought in the colonies and who came back here, and all these histories are very poorly reported.
I professionisti bianchi, gli architetti bianchi occupano quasi tutta la scena.
The professional architects and the professional historians are white and occupy most of the scene.
E l'abbiamo visto 3 minuti fa.
And we saw them 3 minutes ago. Or even now, I was.
Se questa è la nostra base delle conoscenze, lo storico sarebbe piuttosto cauto di fronte a grandi progetti di riuso e a grossi investimenti di valorizzazione di questo o quel manufatto. Prima sarebbe più importante studiare assieme in gruppi multidisciplinari, assumere e coinvolgere una prospettiva postcoloniale, scansare come la peste ogni ulteriore apologia. Soprattutto fondamentale appare non isolare mai i manufatti o i disegni urbani dai loro contesti storici. Queste cautele sono necessarie non solo per i progetti di valorizzazione, recupero e riuso, ma per il contesto culturale in cui noi oggi ci muoviamo. La colonialgia sta dietro ogni angolo e potrebbe avviluppare, distorcere qualunque pur ben intenzionato progetto di riuso. Nessuno può seriamente pensare di distruggere, e non lo fa Ruth Ben-Ghiat, ma nemmeno un restauro da solo può garantire la necessaria sovversione del vecchio valore d'uso coloniale di quei manufatti. Anche ricostruire un monumento o un palazzo coloniale, per non dire all'opposto distruggerlo, può avere conseguenze e assumere echi e risvolti che talvolta potrebbe essere pericoloso sottovalutare, perché da noi in Italia il bravo italiano è dietro ogni angolo.
Okay, so I have to be very careful with this part of the translation because this is the future, and I think that when you call for what could be in our future and how we can resolve these problems, I should try to be a little bit more accurate.
You're very accurate.
Oh.
And maybe better, you're my
That's a good answer. Okay, so if this is the basis of our understanding, then the historian should be more or less cautious in front of the big projects to reuse or large reinvestments or valorizzazioni, which are the to give value to these. And the term manifesta, I would use artifact. Building. Okay. All right. So first would be one of the most important things to study, and would be to study together in multidisciplinary groups, and to assume and to bring everyone together collectively about this post-colonial perspective. And well, this was the interesting point. And to get rid of, like, the pest, the Black Plague, I would probably think is the term, every ulterior apology about this subject. And more importantly, and more fundamental, is not only to isolate, not to isolate these objects or buildings or urban designs, but from their historical context. Okay, so jump over here. Okay, so even to reconstruct a monument or a colonial palace or building, or not even to say the opposite, to destroy it, could have consequences and could assume echoes and risvolti, which would be, they would turn back, that could have very dangerous outcomes and should not be underestimated. Because here in Italy, the bravo Italiano, which I think the Italian good fellow, is behind every corner.
She's a cultural anthropologist who has combined fieldwork and archival research in her studies of architecture and city planning in the Italian colonies between 1869 and 1943. Her book on the subject, Moderns Abroad, Architecture, Cities, and Italian Imperialism, published in 2007, won an International Planning History Society Book Prize in 2008. She's also co-editor of Italian Colonialism, and she collaborated with filmmakers such as Caterina Borelli on the documentary film Asmara, Eritrea in 2008. And she's currently completing work on a book on the force or lack of force for old fascist symbols that still exist in Italy, especially in the Ponte Marshall areas around Rome. Yes? I give you the, you don't need it, sorry. Okay, thank you. Welcome, Mia.
The synthesis of my ongoing thoughts about what to do with old fascist buildings lying around Italy, of which there are so many. But the very first thing, since I think we're talking about this building, some of you down here have been working on the dossier about this building. So everything I'm saying sort of converges towards the topic of this particular building. But the first thing to say is another item in the theme of what is specific to Italy, what is unique, is it is actually difficult to genuinely, honestly distinguish between the colonies and the Italy that was dominated by fascism. I mean, obviously there are differences, but there's an area where they overlap. And that area largely is state techniques, techniques of control, and just the approaches that the state brought to different places were not actually different. They used sometimes slightly different words, but essentially the repertoire was the same, and that's certainly true in architecture. That's even easier to spot in architecture than elsewhere. Substantial parts of Italy, including Sicily for many, were really colonized. We may call it internal colonialism, or we can play with the words, but essentially Bolzano is a perfect example. The Alto Adige and the arch, the triumphal arch covered in its fasci, that's still there, represents that quite perfectly. It's part of what I'm describing as that ambiguous zone of overlap, or that blur. When is it colonial and when is it fascist, or when is it fascist colonial? When are fascist techniques of control being imposed on Italy, but in a colonial way? In Libya, where Gaddafi turned the Italian colonial past into his political capital, until the bitter end, he was using the idea of Western empire as kind of the straw man against which he was necessary. Interestingly, under him, that was when there was the greatest number of demolitions of recognizable Italian buildings. I'm talking about Tripoli really mostly, although there are cases elsewhere in Libya. So that's an instance where having the building was actually not necessary to memory, but rather the opposite. The way in which post-colonial Libya shaped its story, its narration, its national story about the Italian past went hand in hand with actually eliminating quite a few of the traces. So the landscape is not so dominated by visible Italianness, although lots of things remain. The counterpoint to that I would use, and that is probably the best known of all of them, is the city of Asmara in Eritrea. I'll just start right away by saying I have rather strong negative feelings about the paradox of the World Heritage people having recognized the Italian, mostly 1930s built environment in the city of Asmara as a great cultural good, because of the fact that this actually gives support to a very, very brutal dictatorial regime. It sort of provides cover for a regime. So at the very least, I have negative feelings about not talking about it. I think it's fine that it happened, but we need to really think about the cost of treasuring architecture because it is particularly appealing, which it is in Asmara. So Asmara is, in my landscape, my personal schema of all of this, it is the place where there's an immense amount of Italian-built environment. I have been there with Italians and I've seen them actually freak out, which is really fun for me, and say, oh my God, you know, this is what it was like at my grandmother's house. I mean, there's a recognition, it's really visceral. It's been very interesting for me to behold, and I've heard people say, it's amazing, in my neighborhood in Italy, I hate these buildings, but here, they're beautiful. People in Asmara are not talking about Italian colonialism all the time. They're really not. I mean, first of all, they love to talk about the dictatorship and they don't do that in public. But what they will talk about is the Ethiopian regime. And in fact, the survival of the Italian buildings is a signifier for most Asmarini of the fact that they survived the subsequent Ethiopian oppression. It is no longer a sign of the Italian colonial past. That's really interesting. We have all these buildings, we have all this kind of surface that just says Italy, Italy, Italy to us, to most of us. And that is actually not, it's been sort of recoded, right? So if you put that next to the Libya thing, oh, look, we have lots of reminders, and yet they're reminding people of something that's not quite what it would remind us of. My point is, I think that we can identify a limited set of models, and this is really what I'm interested in, is just to figure out the ways in which societies, cities work out just how they can use the environment that they inherit to their ends, to their best ends. That's it. So they can be adapted, re-encoded. Often they're overwhelmed, right? Things will be built on top, destroyed, and appropriated often. I think my very favorite, the thing that interests me the most, is when the structure remains, but its meaning has changed. And in a way that everybody knows about. It doesn't actually need to be kind of thought out. So that would be the Asmara example. Why are fascist monuments or buildings still standing in Italy? And she was really talking about, this is Ruth Ben-Gia. Hey, let's face it, these architects, the ones who did the buildings we like from the 1930s, so Berrani particularly, okay, well let's just face that they were fascists. So this began, so it took a generation and a half or 2 generations. And part of that was liberating because it allowed people to say, well, some of these buildings were good. Okay, so now we have a historiography of architecture under fascism. It didn't happen right away. But for a long time, the position was, we acknowledge that these architects were fascists, or some were more fascist than others, and still they did good buildings. So the debate is really, well, can you make good art, right, if you're a bad person politically? So that was where things were for a long time. The big question then is, well, what do you do? Do what? That's what it says in my notes, do what? And my key question is for whom? Because I think that this question of audience really is crucial. You know, is the audience foreigners? Is it people writing in magazines elsewhere? Is it new populations coming into Italy? Is it 2 generations from now? Personally, I would kind of target what's it going to look like in 2 generations, but that's just me. I would say texts are a big deal on these buildings, right? The inscriptions that have not been modified, I think, are more loaded than the buildings themselves. Although there's a lot to talk about in terms of whether buildings retain political meaning. But if you have, you know, the signs and nothing's changed and the language is the same and Mussolini's being quoted everywhere, you know, I think it's hard to have irony or critical distance from that. So one could put, you know, didactic signs up, but in any case, for me personally, I think leaving intact texts up shows a kind of ambivalence. You know, because really, maybe fascism will come back. You know, and we might use these buildings again. And even though everything that's happening now is happening now, I don't think it's going to come back in its original form. So now we get to the punchline. It's very good. The punchline is actually, I just decided to make the shortest possible list of methods. So here are the methods for what one can do with fascist legacy buildings, or heritage, as some scholars do call it. Delete, that was my first one, delete. So there are good reasons why Italy didn't delete, because there were so many buildings, so much incredible investment in infrastructure, and nobody can afford to get rid of that. So one keeps the buildings. Modify and represent. So the thing is that in the former Italian colonies, the Italian regimes have passed. It's only in Italy that I feel like there's still a haunting. And you go elsewhere where there are these buildings, other things have happened since, so it's all about which regime, but it's also about the recency of the regime. And it's only in Italy that my sense is that there's a doubt. There's still a kind of, oh, we're not quite sure. I mean, that, for me, lingers a lot in the buildings I visit so consistently. Reframing through addition. I think I said this, I think for me that's the great art. And there are great examples. There's a great example in Algiers where the French, under the French colonials, they put up, I think it's Rifut, but that was obscuring the mosque, and that's been reconfigured since, so that the French statue, the equestrian statue, is still there, but other things have happened so that its smallness is really, really evident. I think that's really masterful.
So in this second part, as I said, we're gonna change again a little bit the register, and also it's part improvised, because as you saw from the program, it was a different order, so we try also to improvise based on the arrival of our guest. So the next two speakers are Adelida Husni Bey and Mia Fuller. Adelida will give a lecture performance. She's an artist, and she's also a pedagogue interested in anarcho-collectivism, theater and law, and urban studies. And she organized workshops, produced publications, radio broadcasts, archives, and exhibitions. Work focused on using non-competitive pedagogical models through the framework of contemporary art. Tonight, part of her lecture performance will be also this combination of Italian and English, just to continue the complications. Is there anything else that I should have mentioned? Yeah? So please welcome Adelida.
Number 1, we, whose names are subscribed, do in the name of all the poor oppressed people in England, and that was brought in by war, which hath and still does establish murder and theft in the hands of some branches of mankind over others, which is the greatest outward burden and unrighteous power that the creation groans under, and left this land successively to you, their children. And therefore, though you did not kill or thieve, yet you hold that cursed thing in your hand by the power of the sword. And so you justify the wicked deeds of your fathers and the sin of your fathers shall be visited upon the head of you and your children, to the third and fourth generation, and longer too. For though you and your ancestors got your propriety by murder and theft, you keep it by the same power from us that have an equal right to the land with you. For the earth, with all her fruits of corn, cattle, and such like, was made to be a common storehouse of livelihood to all mankind, friend and foe, without exception. We stand for housing for all as a right. The council housing's waiting list does not house people. It's a political contract to divide people and justify homelessness. We are opposed to any discrimination over the right to housing on the grounds of race, sex, or age, or family status. It's illegal to kill off your landlord or to trespass upon his estate, but to charge a rent for a slum is okay. To condemn two adults and 3 children to stay in a hovel that's rotten and damp with decay, it's a thing that's perfectly legal. It's illegal if you're a traveler to camp by the side of the road. It's proper and right for the rich and the great to live in a mansion, their own estate. It was got from the people by pillage and rape. It's a thing that's perfectly legal. The fair distribution of the benefits and burdens resulting from the urbanization process shall be shared by all. In the month of July, in the year of 54, there was slates on the roof, there were holes in the floor, there were rats in the cellar, we didn't have a cent. When the landlord came, he put up the rent. Oh, that greedy landlord, oh, the landlord, oh. Well, he said it was a pity, and it really was a shame, but he couldn't spare a copper for the mending of the drain, and the paint was so expensive that we ought to lend a hand and pay a little extra to the man who owns the land. Oh, the greedy landlord, oh, the landlord, oh. And he promised to be faithful, and he promised to be true, and he promised that he'd make a little house as good as new, and the folks would come around, see you from miles, and pay a little extra to the man who owns the ground. Oh, greedy landlord, oh, the landlord, oh. Considering that space, insofar as it is a scarce resource in relation to the common good, should be addressed according to use value principles. Considering that the use of space for financial accumulation based on its exchange value cannot interfere with the use value of space. Considering that housing, as granted by the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights under the Right to Adequate Housing 2009, entails protection from forced eviction irrespective of title, recognizing that varying forms of occupation are reactions to the social economic circumstances that produce inequality, vacancy, gentrification, and displacement in occupied spaces, trying to safeguard the use of space over the exchange value of space. That's all for me.
The Ministry of the Colonies, it became the home of the foul.
Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations headquarters, symbolizing the new established world order. So today, what is left of the fascist imperial cityscape is a totally sanitized space with the forward quarters facing a memorial to the victims of the 9/11 attacks in New York, in place of the Ethiopian obelisk, which has been returned to Ethiopia as a part of compensation plans for colonial crimes and reparation. And we are all talking about, or trying to struggle with the idea of fascist heritage, colonial heritage, and the possible reuse. Well, this story is a story of reconversion. I could say it is in the kind of the dark side of reuse, and we will see how somehow. In this way, the transition from the ministry of the colonies to the forward quarters is not a minor event. If we consider that the conversion from colonial state violence to UN multilateralism consists of a shift from the necropolitical right over life and death to the exercise of power through the optimization of biological life in the post-colonial world. So still under the aegis of modernism, the decade following the end of World War II saw the rise of new projects that represented a new liaison between power and architecture. The headquarters of the United Nations in New York, the VW's in Rome, and the UNESCO in Paris, among many others, were the products finally of the spread of liberal power on a global scale. So, for instance, Oscar Niemeyer, who designed the UN home in New York, stated, "We must have in mind what is the UN. We have to make something representing the true spirit of our age, of comprehension and solidarity. They reflect an organization that set the nations of the world in a common direction and gives to the world security." These are the words of Niemeyer. I was listening to the theatrical performance that Mauro, Tatiana, and Alessandro performed yesterday, and actually, like, looking at few excerpts from the trialogue, I thought that one of the exchange between Lina and Giuseppe could have been perfectly in the mouth of Cafiero and Ridolfi, and I'm reading, so I'm also doing a bit of acting, if you don't mind. So Lina says, "We cannot just consider this building as an element from the past. The present, which is the future of 1939, is a result of that time, of that architecture tied to that ideology." Giuseppe: "But I designed it in 1936. It was another moment. I cannot be judged nowadays for what happened during the time. Only those who were present and part of that project can understand what was happening. Nobody external can judge us." So, to a certain extent, this was like kind of enlightening, and to me, it made perfect sense to this very case. So, where actually there is still a dilemma among the many transitions occurred in history, from fascist ideology to colonialism and the UN principle of constituency, what values the building stand for and what image of society it aims to be represented. So, of course, like, we cannot like consider like the built form as a self-sufficient in this analysis. We need to look at the context, the historical dimension, and all the other actors that are part of this network, which is in the case specifically the obelisk of Aksum. So the post-colonial relation with Ethiopia kept in suspension the reconciliation process until the restitution of the obelisk of Aksum as a gesture marking the end of colonial tensions. So on the 11th September 2009, the mayor of Rome, at that time the neo-fascist Gianni Alemanno, in the presence of the US authorities, inaugurated a memorial to the victims of the attacks on the World Trade Center in New York, 11th September 2001. The memorial, taking the space formerly occupied by the Aksum obelisk, consists of a plate placed between two columns that were taken directly from the fountain of Curia Innocenziana in Piazza di Montecitorio in Rome. This new spatial intervention clearly reproduced the profile of Union's twin towers, and ironically, on the plaque are carved the words of philosopher George Santayana: "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." The representation in Rome of the Nexus War and Terror right of food provides a physical evidence of post-9/11 global security concerns that call for international intervention along the axis of security development, combining military issues with development and humanitarianism. So So this gave the international public a pragmatic interpretation of poverty as dangerous, as the perilous path leading to invisible threats, risks, and fear. Victims can turn into enemies, and today's victim can transform into tomorrow's perpetrators, becoming the object of concern and the potential target of both civilian and military technologies. So the aesthetic representation of such equilibrium and conflation of powers is perfectly demonstrated in the visual spatial encounter between the FAO and the 9/11 memorial, namely the new two monuments of post-colonial Rome. Post-fascist Italy basically inaugurated a new phase that is inscribed in the larger idea of, like, you know, kind of urban planning that is typically modern, so that is based on this kind of opposition between dirty and clean. So a new clean piazza finally in 2009 was finally established and designed. So this is something that usually addresses like a big issue of vulnerability, like in public spaces in post-fascist Italy, that we could call also as an experiment of dehistoricization in post-colonial Italy. I'm borrowing the word dehistoricization from the work of Michael Rothberg, who actually defines it in the following way, and I'm opening the quote. This phenomena cuts through the calcified distinctions of period and identity in order to create new ways of seeing history as a dynamic force field of intersecting stories. The other is a force of dehistorization that removes the intersecting stories from any relationship to power. So this demonstrated the way such a depoliticization finds its historical roots in Italy's lack of direct engagement with decolonization. In post-fashion and post-colonial Italy, this question belongs to the general debate about the role of fascist heritage, where the relics of fascism and colonialism have been normalized within Italian cityscapes, often escaping the critique and consideration of anti-fascist politics. So here concepts like deviation, dissociation, discontinuity, dispersion, and rupture that have challenged and contested the idea of an architectural knowledge embedded to power, authority, and violence, struggle until this very day with the problem posed by the immanence of fascist structure in allegedly post-fascist work. So the specific case of the square and its chameleon in architecture are for me a kind of interesting demonstration of this problem. They also showed the afterlife of colonialism through the principles and rationalities of colonial and imperial rule that have survived in the absence of formal colonialism. So let me conclude now by saying that within a context that the discourse on memory and the elaboration of the colonial past intertwine with the definition of a new power, relations, and techniques of government over others, the question around the fascist colonial heritage still brings to the fore the difficult dilemma around the possibility of critical reuse or reorientation that can contribute to an effective and true decolonization. By discussing the cases of erasure and reuse by concealment, that occurred in the square, actually. And we verified that because of the absence of any critical dislocation so far, or transgressive activity in the process of transformation, categories such as reimagination and subversion are struggling until this very day. Thank you.
My name is Andrea Bagnato, and this project is made by two people, and the second person is Anna Positano, who is hiding in the back there. She's a wonderful photographer and artist, and the photographs you are looking at are her work, town called Arborea, formerly Mussolinia, in the western part of Sardinia. It's a new town that was founded in the 1920s. So what I'm going to do now is really like to run you through the story of Mussolini through its ecology and through its natural elements, which I think works quite nicely with the idea of the planetary garden. So, number one, water. In particular, Sardinia had the highest rates of malaria mortality, comparable to those of sub-Saharan Africa today, just to give you an idea. The SBS company devised the drainage of a Teralba Valley, an 8,000-hectare region of malaria marshlands in western coast of Sardinia. So then what happens is that after Benito Mussolini seizes power in 1922, the government appropriates the reclamation project by nationalizing the company, this private company, SBS. And the town that was under construction at the center of the valley is renamed as Villaggio Mussolini and later Mussolinia, and it's completed in 1928. And it's no coincidence that Mussolini's most architecturally important building is actually several kilometers outside of the town. And as Mussolinia was being built, the majority of Sardinians were still living in the uplands and in the mountains, actually, where the friction of the terrain limited the presence of the central state. Intermission. From the prison notebook number 19 of Antonio Gramsci. Quote, "The poverty of the South was historically inexplicable for the popular masses of the North. They did not understand that unity had not taken place on the basis of equality, but as hegemony of the North over the South in a territorial version of the town-country relationships. In other words, the North concretely was an octopus which enriched itself at the expense of the South, and its economic industrial increment was in direct proportion to the impoverishment of the economy and the agriculture of the South. The ordinary man from northern Italy thought rather that, if the Mezzogiorno made no progress after having been liberated by the Bourbon regime, this meant that the causes of poverty were not external to be sought in objective economic and political conditions, but internal, innate in the population of the South. And this all the more since there was a deeply rooted belief in the great natural wealth of the terrain of the South. There only remained one explanation, the organic incapacity of the inhabitants, their barbarity, their biological inferiority. These already widespread opinions were consolidated and actually theorized by the sociologists of positivism, acquiring the strength of scientific truth in a period of superstition about science. Number three, the last one, drains. Most of the public buildings and homes in Mussolini were designed by the engineer Carlo Avanzini in a mild, turn-of-the-century eclectic style, with rustic yellow plaster and stone finishes, as you can see from the church here. The early settler homes attempted to reproduce the tropes of northern Italian farms so that the colony, of course, could be made to feel at home. But the street grid of Mussolini is unashamedly modern, setting it apart from the new towns of the Agropontino that actually attempt to replicate a kind of traditional and medieval urban form. There is only one square in Mussolini, which is nothing but the crossroad of the two main axes, around which the town hall, the primary school, the hotel, the church, and the workers' club are all clustered. On the bell tower is inscribed the word Resurgo, I resurrect. So this is because the peculiarities of Sardinian society, translated in a small nuclear family, with a strong tradition of female independence. This was, of course, was not considered suitable to what the regime was trying to achieve, the settler life. And of course, Sardinians were not considered Italian enough, because they were shepherds and not farmers. In contrast, women from Veneto were prolific, and the men were used to agricultural labor. Techno-political power comes again to Mussolini when the Rockefeller Foundation, with reconstruction funds after the Second World War, chooses Sardinia as the place to test the newly discovered DDT. So between 1946 and 1948, the entire island of Sardinia is sprayed with insecticide with the purpose of eradicating malaria and, of course, of making the land fertile. In the post-war order, so agricultural land all around Italy was finally distributed to the farmers themselves by the center-right government in agreement, of course, with the Marshall Plan to prevent the possibility of a communist unrest in the countryside. I leave it here. Thanks.
exotic places from the 1800th century, and photography was a way to promote colonialism within the various countries. Actually, what concerned me the most was the celebrative approach of photography toward fascist architecture. Everyone sees what they know. So that basically means that your own background, in a way, affects the way you perceive your world. So, aware of that and of my position of a photographer from the continent, I tried to focus on the territory of Mussolini, as it was a familiar landscape, and that was quite easy. During the fascism, as Andrea said, this land was colonized by farmers coming from Pianura Padana, mostly from Veneto area. And there are many similarities between this colony and the motherland in terms of landscape.